Okay, our final problem in homework 4 is the comparison of the crisis model that we're currently in, financial crisis model, and the normal mode. Okay, so this model explains why there are trillions of dollars to this day of excess reserves in the banking system. Okay, so the problem begins out just like it did previously. The shock parameter 87.1 is there. The required reserves ratio is 0.2. The quantity of demand deposits in the banking system is 462 billion. The slope is 0.05. Okay. The intercept, if you remember, the intercept is just the sum of required reserves and the shock parameter. That's what we get over here. Okay, so 5.3. And then the slope is 0.05. Okay. If the Fed sets its target for the federal funds rate at 0.43, then the discount rate is going to be 1.43, 100 basis points above that, right? The vertical section is $97.482 billion. And the horizontal section is kinked by the discount rate, which is a non-binding price ceiling. We hit enter and we can find out that we got all these questions right. Okay, moving on. We want to know the equilibrium quantity of reserves. Well, the equilibrium quantity of reserves, because the demand curve crosses the vertical section of the supply curve, then the equilibrium quantity of reserves is just whatever reserves are, right? We're going to plug this quantity into our demand equation. Our demand equation had an intercept of 5.3 and a slope of 0.05. We're going to multiply that by the quantity of reserves. So our federal funds rate is 0.426. Okay. Which is greater than our target. But it's pretty close. If you go 3 decimal places, it's identical. So we'll go is equal to. The discount rate is 1.43. Required reserves is found by multiplying demand deposits by the reserve requirement ratio. So required reserves is 92.4. And excess reserves is the difference between quantity reserves, which is 97.42, and required reserves, which is 92.4. So excess reserves are only $5 billion, roughly. Okay, so let's hit enter and see if we got everything correct, and we should. Okay, we got everything correct. Okay, now when the reserves demand crosses a vertical section of supply, which is the case here, the federal funds market, I call it normal mode, is in normal mode. Okay. If the Fed wishes to decrease interest rates in this mode, it shifts reserves supply rightward by conducting an open market purchase. Oh, by purchasing bonds. Doing so is called an open market purchase. Okay, so I had to change this answer to buying securities from banks. So I hit enter and we should get that right. Okay, and we do. So if the Fed wishes to decrease interest rates, so it can push it down a little bit more by doing what? Buying securities from banks, and that's called an open market purchase. Okay. Now, in late November 2008, the Federal Reserve started buying $600 billion in mortgage-backed securities. You can read more here. Assuming the Fed purchased 21.9% of these securities from banks by the end of the first week of December, the size of such a purchase is what? So 29% of 600, right? I can calculate that over here in Excel. And I have 131.4. Okay, 131.4. This purchase increases the quantity of reserves supplied in the federal funds market by that same amount. So the quantity of, or the vertical section of reserves will go from this value, it'll increase by that. Okay. We didn't say anything about the discount rate, so we're going to leave the discount rate at 1.43. And we hit enter and we get what? Let's go find out. Okay, so instead of doing the addition there, I'm going to go ahead and copy that in Excel and calculate it in Excel. So the new quantity of reserves is $228.882 billion. So this is a monstrous open market purchase, right? It's so monstrous that it pushes the federal funds rate into negative territory, because this is zero here, right? Here's zero. So we have -4, -8. And the new equilibrium is down here, somewhere between -4 and -8. So if the Fed just does this huge purchase, it's going to potentially push interest rates to negative territory. That's the supply of reserves. This is the demand for reserves. This is the federal funds rate. And this is quantity of reserves, right? Okay, so close that out. The new quantity of at the new equilibrium, the quantity of reserves is 228.882 because this value here is 228.882, and you plug it right into the demand curve. So right there. Okay. So now what we have to do is we have to calculate the equilibrium federal funds rate, which is going to be negative. So we got to go get the original demand curve for reserves. So the original demand curve is 5.3 minus 0.05 times this new quantity of reserves, right? Our new quantity of reserves is 228.882, so we're plugging that into the reserves demand curve, and we get a negative 6.144, okay? Which is below the Fed's target. The Fed's target, remember, was 0.43. That's the Fed's target, the Fed's current target. So this pushes it way below the Fed's target, pushes in negative territory. The discount rate is still 1.43. Required reserves is still 92.4. But what happened to excess reserves? Excess reserves is the quantity of reserves minus required reserves. And so excess reserves balloon up to 136.482. Okay? This explains why reserves get so huge, right? Excess reserves get so huge. Okay, in 2008, the Fed was given a new tool. It can pay banks interest on their reserves. Okay? So, because banks with excess reserves would rather lend these reserves to the Fed than to other banks, at this rate, than to other banks at the equilibrium federal funds rate, which is negative, interest on reserves kinks the demand for reserves. Reserves demand. Okay? It kinks it down here. See, interest on reserves is set at 0.43, right? So you got the demand for reserves. This part of the demand curve is gone, and so banks with excess reserves would prefer to lend their reserves to the Fed at 0.43 than lend to other banks at a negative 6%, right? So that kinks the demand curve. And the new equilibrium ends up being right here, okay? So the new equilibrium ends up being right there, okay? So we're going to close that out. At the new equilibrium, the quantity reserves, well, that's still whatever it was, right? It was this, right? The equilibrium federal funds rate is where the two cross. So that is 0.43, right? The interest on reserves level, 0.43. So if you think about this, the market interest rate in this market is 0.43. The equilibrium is 0.43. The interest on reserves is 0.43, and the target is 0.43. Okay, so now this is equal to the Fed's target. The discount rate is still 1.43. Required reserves is still the product of these two, the required reserves ratio and the quantity of demand deposits. So it's still 92.4. Excess reserves, well, if this is the quantity of reserves and this is required reserves, excess reserves are still are $136.482 billion. Okay, and then in the memo that you turn in, you'll have to explain why this is kinked, which I did above. Okay, when the horizontal section of the reserves demand crosses the vertical section, right here, the federal funds market, I refer to it as crisis mode, financial crisis mode. Okay, and that should be it. We should have all the answers correct. So in crisis mode, if the Fed does an open market purchase and moves supply over to here, the Fed does an open market purchase, it doesn't change the interest rate because the interest rate went from here to here, right? It doesn't change the interest rate. So the way the Fed does it now is it does it this way. If it wants to raise interest rates, all it does is it raises the discount rate up to here, and then it sets a new higher interest on reserves level, and then erases the old interest on reserves level, the old discount rate level, and that erases this part of the demand curve. So if the Fed wants to raise interest rates, it just simply does it by decree. It just raises the interest on reserves, and then also at the same time it raises the discount rate. So we can close out and call it good on part 4.